welcome to the last rough cut of the semester. And if you're interested in doing a rough cut next year, please contact Anna Tuttle. She's trying to put a schedule together for next year's rough cut. So if you have something you want to present, yeah, we'd all love to hear it. So also, I wanted to say there's an Earth Science Colloquium where Dominik is speaking tomorrow at 4:30. I think there's refreshments at 4 and then at 4:30, talking about mountain pine beetle and fire. Hey guys, there's seats up front. Come on up. So it's great to have Dominik Kulakowski here from Clark University. Dominik's in the Department of Geography as well as Biology. And we met in Switzerland when we were both on sabbatical last year at the Swiss Federal Institute. Dominik's research is on the effects of climate, disturbance, and land use on forest ecosystems. And he works in the Rocky Mountains as well as European forests. So he's got a really interesting perspective. And I would say he's one of the big thinkers on disturbance synergies, that is the kind of interactions and feedbacks among different disturbances. Dominik got his PhD at University of Colorado, worked with Tom Veblen there, and he's written several influential papers. If you do any work in forest ecosystems, you've probably read something by Dominik. And his website says he's testified 3 times before Congress, so that's kind of interesting side. But thank you very much for coming.
Kathy, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for the introduction. And thanks very much for being here. I very much enjoyed my visit and enjoyed meeting all of you. I can't help to point out that this is the Rough Cut seminar, and I flew United. And so I'm happy to report I'm neither roughed up nor cut up. So, so far, everything is going as well as it possibly could go. So there are a lot of conversations about understanding and managing forest ecosystems in the context of a changing climate, changing disturbance regimes, and changing land use. And a lot of those conversations invoke ideas of resilience. And so this is the topic I'd like to take up with you today. And in doing so, talking about some of my work in the Rocky Mountains as well as in Europe. So first of all, disturbances and resilience. So we know, especially those of us in this room, that disturbances create variability of tree, sand, and landscape patch conditions. And that can modulate disturbance effects and post-disturbance regeneration. And so from this, we have the body of literature dealing with disturbance interaction, which is something I'm going to talk about in tomorrow's seminar. Additionally, disturbances create spatial heterogeneity that can promote biodiversity, as some of you here in Montana study, primary production in certain cases, wildlife habitat, hydrogeologic protection, and also ecosystem resilience, or so we like to say. And because of this, disturbances are increasingly parts of conversations dealing with the provision of multiple ecosystem services, as well as desired future conditions. And while resilience has become prominent in our discussions of global environmental change, this concept remains fairly fuzzy. So most basically, when we talk about resilience, we talk about the ability of a system to recover or tolerate certain disturbances without shifting to an alternate state that's controlled by different processes. And so we have this familiar ball and cup model where our ecosystem of interest is depicted by the green dots, and the states are the ecosystems as we know them. Most often, ecosystems exist within some level of variation within a particular state, but occasionally, ecosystems are pushed outside of the bounds of what they can handle, and ecosystems can tip into alternate stable states. So this idea has been around for a while. It's useful, it's simple, and it's a popular idea. But I would draw your attention to the fact that our understanding of resilience hinges on our definitions of states. So the way we define states affects our understanding of resilience, which in turn affects our understanding and assessment of ecological change, such that the broader the range of conditions that we consider normal, the less we see dynamics or disturbances as altering or maybe even destroying ecosystems. So in this context, our definition of what we refer to as states becomes paramount. So what do we mean by a state? And how do we differentiate that from an alternate state? What do we mean by the processes that control that state? And what do we mean by the processes that control it if it were an alternate state? So with this in mind, I would turn your attention to Quaking aspen, which most of the work I've done in Quaking aspen has been in Colorado. And Quaking aspen is one of the most widely distributed, ecologically most important deciduous trees, certainly in Colorado and I think many other parts of the Rockies. And aspen is interesting in part because it has two regeneration modes. It can regenerate from seed, although this is thought to be fairly unusual. It can also resprout vegetatively. So it has these two modes of regeneration, whereas most of the conifers that co-occur in the same ecosystem only have one mode of regeneration. And bless you, when we think of aspen, we customarily think of a prototypic cereal species, so one that established right after a stand replacing disturbance, such as fire, regenerates and takes over the disturbed site. But in some cases, aspen can form self-replacing stands, like this one, which can remain pure aspen stands, sometimes for many centuries, even in the absence of any major disturbances. In other places, however, aspen can be successionally replaced by the more shade-tolerant conifers. In Colorado, this is mainly Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. And on a landscape scale, it looks like something like this. And because successional replacement of aspen by conifers has been fairly widespread, there's been a lot of attention in management and in the popular press about an apparent decline of aspen, the shift from aspen forests to coniferous forests with potential consequences for biodiversity, for tourism, and so on and so forth. Additionally, over the past 15 or 20 years or so, we've been seeing this type of phenomena, which you see illustrated in the foreground of this photograph, which you can see, this is actually taken during the summer, so during the growing season. And what we're looking at is a stand of aspen in which the majority of aspen are dead. And there's been this die-off of aspen across its range, starting somewhere about 15 or 20 years ago, which is fairly widespread. And again, this has caught the attention of policymakers, of managers, and it's been the subject of scientific inquiry and management efforts to prevent this apparent decline or loss of aspen in the landscape. So I want to begin looking at this, again, in the broader framework of how we understand resilience in different states in the context of climatic variability. So here we worked with, I worked with Philip Hanna, who's a former graduate student, and we sampled 10 sites in northwestern Colorado that looked something like this. So these were aspen-dominated sites in which at least half of the adult aspen were dead and had died fairly recently. We want to stress that these aspen stands were not in transition zones. So we're not talking about ecotones. We're not talking about the edge of geographic distribution. We're talking about aspen stands that are well within their range. And we collected about 500 increment core samples, tree ring samples from these sites to look at the effects of climate on this apparent aspen mortality. And Philip, in his thesis, looked at, in this case, the effect of temperature on aspen growth. So the red bars, or the red bar, is the significant relationship, which indicates a positive negative correlation between temperature and growth. So warmer temperatures equate slower growth, less growth. Cooler temperatures equate larger tree rings, more growth. Okay? Simple climate signal. Similarly, he looked at the effect of precipitation and found a significant positive relationship between winter precipitation, which is the dominant form of precipitation here, and aspen growth. Positive relationship meaning the more snow we have, the more precipitation we have, the better aspen grow. Conversely, the drier it is, the slower aspen growth, the smaller the annual ring. Okay, another climate signal. And then he compared the growth rates of aspen that had died, which are depicted here in red, with aspen that had not died, which are depicted here in green. And on the horizontal axis, we have a basal area increment of 3 years. And on the vertical axis, we have a growth trend of the previous 10 years. So this is just spring width. And what we see looking at this figure is that the dead trees are all concentrated towards the 0-0 mark, meaning that prolonged decreased growth, either at the 3-year and or the 10-year time frame, resulted in aspen mortality. So trees that died were growing slowly for a number of years prior to mortality. So mortality in this case is not an instantaneous process, but rather it's a process that results from multiple years of below average growth, which, as we saw in the previous two figures, was a result of warm and dry conditions. Okay, so looking at this now, we see, okay, there's a climate signal in growth, and that climate signal translates eventually to mortality. And then finally, if we looked at the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is depicted here in yellow, and we contrast it with the number of deaths of aspen, as indicated by the last complete year of growth, there is a statistically significant relationship between drought and mortality, such that most of the mortality happened during drought. Okay? So thinking about aspen decline and thinking about climatic variability, we see this recent clear signal of, like this? Okay. So there's a clear signal here. Is that better? Okay. There's a clear signal of climate on recent mortality of aspen. And so the growth and mortality of aspen away from transitional zones is associated with climatic variation, and the growth shows a climate signal and mortality shows a climate signal. Okay, that makes sense, and that's consistent with our expectations. And this is a paper that some of us who work in aspen have seen before. This is by a paper that Charles Kay put out in 1997, where he contrasted the historical distribution of aspen, and I draw your attention to the use of the term historical, versus present distribution. The historical distribution is depicted in black, present distribution is depicted in gray. And in all cases, we see a decline of aspen, a decrease of aspen. But if we look at the figure caption, historical is actually defined as 1962, right? And present is defined as 1990, okay? And this, so it's a decline of aspen during the late part of the 20th century, right? And this makes sense. It's something that is observed, and it is something that we can tie to a climate signal. But we start thinking about, okay, what do we do with this? You know, how do we understand this in terms of longer time frame? And if long-term aspen distribution looks something like this, where there's been relatively little variability over the past centuries or so, and then this sudden decline, we would understand recent trends differently than if the longer distribution looked something like this. So this is obviously a shout out to concepts of historic range of variability, which have been criticized because of arbitrary reference periods, because of the current effects of climate change, and so on and so forth. But those criticisms notwithstanding, all concepts of variability ultimately stress ecosystem dynamics, as opposed to stationarity or optimization of forest structure. So they help us expect change, either a little bit of change or a lot of change, depending on the time frame that we're looking at. And additionally, having a longer view of ecosystem dynamics helps us distinguish changes that may fall within the natural dynamics versus those that are novel. Right? living in the time during which we're living, we may be overly sensitive to expecting catastrophic ecosystem collapse. It's not that that isn't happening in some places, but I think as a community of academics, we might be a little too prone to assuming that that's always what we're seeing. And I would argue that having a longer term view helps protect us from that trap. So in this particular case, if we're talking about aspen and if we're talking about the American West, one way of distinguishing different ecosystems is based on long-term fire regimes. So in the upper figure, we see a figure that is probably familiar to many of us, which depicts an ecosystem that was once shaped by relatively frequent fires. And then we have fire suppression, and then all sorts of ecological changes, which have been well documented in the Southwest especially. But it's important to remember that other ecosystems, especially in more mesic forests, have been shaped by infrequent fires, fires with return intervals measured in centuries. And in those cases, it's less clear that fire suppression has had any major influence. And furthermore, in those types of ecosystems, we almost necessarily have to expect a broader range of conditions that we need to consider as being normal. So we played with this idea, working in the Grand Mesa area, which is in southwestern Colorado. There's a subalpine forest dominated by aspen, Engelmann spruce, and subalpine fir. And we had a unique resource working in this area, which was a map, a historical map, which was produced in 1898 by a guy on horseback, okay, who mapped vegetation, burned areas, and pre-fire vegetation. Okay, an amazing resource, and he did this on horseback, triangulating off of peaks. Right, an amazing task. We georeferenced this map in a geographic information system, and found that the root mean square positional error was somewhere on the order of 100 meters, 150 meters. It's a 1 to 253,000 map. Right, the current standards are about 10 to 20 meters. Right, so. Amazingly accurate map. And it was also valuable because high severity fires pose a specific obstacle for us. Namely, they erase evidence of the ecological conditions that existed prior to the fire. And here we have this really remarkable resource. So I digitized this map, forest type as it existed prior to the last major episode of fires in this area. The last major fires, which happened in the late 1800s, and current vegetation of what is now the Grand Mesa and Gunnison National Forest, distinguishing coniferous dominance versus aspen dominance. And we visited 30 field sites to reconstruct the history of those particular stands using tree ring methods to essentially test the categorical accuracy of the historical map. So we at those 30 sites, we reconstructed to see what the forest was like in the late 1800s. And in all 30 cases, our dendroecological reconstruction matched perfectly with the historical map. Again, amazing resource. And one of the simple messages of that work is on the left side of this figure, the yellow bar depicts the amount of aspen in the landscape in the late 19th century. And the yellow bar graph on the right side of the figure depicts the amount of aspen in the landscape in the late 20th century. So one of the basic messages is that there's actually more aspen in the landscape now than there was 100 years ago, okay? And so what does that mean for our perception of aspen decline, right? Can we legitimately say that aspen is declining over the past several decades? Yes, we can. Can we say that aspen is declining over the past 150 years? We can't. Right? So how do we want to position our ecological understanding? How do we want to position our management decisions in this context? This table, the rows depict forest cover in the late 20th century, and the columns depict forest cover in the late 19th century. So for example, I was told to point with the mouse. So for example, this cell shows stands that were dominated by aspen in the late 19th century, that were burned in the late 19th century, and that are currently dominated by aspen. Okay? So what we see is that the majority of aspen stands, whether they burned or not, are still aspen. But importantly, of the stands that were dominated by conifers prior to these fires, a majority is currently dominated by aspen. So there's a clear transition from coniferous to aspen as a result of these wildfires. And if we look at where this successional replacement of aspen is happening, the rows here depict forest cover in the late 19th century. So if in stands that were dominated by aspen prior to the 19th century, 12 or the majority are self-replacing aspen, whereas the majority of cereal aspen stands are also the ones that were actually conifers 150 years ago. So again, what is our reference period, and what does that mean for our strategies of managing aspen in terms of perception of aspen decline? So if we take a longer term view, severe fires during the late 19th century increased aspen cover. So as much as we can say that aspen has decreased over decades, we also have to admit that over a century or so it's increased. A larger portion of the landscape is actually dominated by aspen now than in the late 19th century. And then another part of the story, which is interesting, is the story of compounded disturbances. And this relates to aspen as well. And this part of the story becomes relevant because the extent, magnitude, and frequency of disturbances is increasing and has been increasing over the past decades. And as a result, there's a larger likelihood of 2 or more disturbances occurring in short succession. And this can affect ecosystems in ways that aren't well understood. And if we want to understand future ecological changes, I would argue that we have to understand the potential effects of these types of compounded interacting disturbances. So bringing this into the fold, in 1997, there was a large windstorm in northwestern Colorado, which blew down about 10,000 hectares of forest in a single afternoon. And 5 years after that, there was a large wildfire, some of which burned the forests that were also blown down and burned other forests as well. We were actually in the field when the fire started, but I assure you that I did not set this research up. You know, it was a lightning strike, it really was. But in either case, it created a really unique opportunity to look at the effects of compounded disturbances on regeneration. And again, I think this is something that we can expect more of in upcoming decades. And one of the things we found is in this figure divides regeneration based on pre-fire composition. Okay? So this is total regeneration in stands that were dominated by aspen, lodgepole pine, and spruce and fir prior to the fires. And not surprisingly, we see more regeneration in aspen following the fires, and secondarily lodgepole pine. And again, this is not a large surprise. We know and we understand that both lodgepole pine and aspen are well adapted to post-fire regeneration. Interestingly, if we look at the stands that only burned, we see over the 12 or so year period for which we have data, that aspen and lodgepole pine are slightly more dominant than the other 2 conifers on the landscape. And here we're looking at the actual species that are regenerating. But what is interesting is if you look at areas that were affected by 2 disturbances in short succession, you see aspen by far dominating the landscape. Right? And this comes back to the fact that aspen can regenerate either vegetatively or by seed. We think what's happening, we're still working on the mechanisms here, but we think that what's happening is that if you have 2 disturbances in short succession, the overall intensity of the second disturbance is higher, which may destroy the seed bank of the conifers. And in either way, it's benefiting quaking aspen. Okay? So we're seeing a transition, sometimes by regeneration of seed, from coniferous forests to aspen forests, but only in areas affected by compounded disturbances. So what does this mean? So we're seeing a climate effect on fires and other disturbances. Okay? So under climate change scenarios, we can expect more fires, more outbreaks, especially of mountain pine beetle, as well as spruce beetle, and more compounded disturbances, and also more drought. If we look at the next level, more fires almost certainly will result in more aspen, partly because aspen regenerate following fires, and partly because aspen are less flammable than the conifers. Outbreaks of mountain pine beetle and spruce beetle obviously don't affect aspen forests. And here we see that aspen is benefiting from compounded disturbances, which are also likely to increase under climate change scenarios. Drought is clearly affecting the ability of aspen to regenerate and grow. So where do all these interactions leave us? Well, it depends. It depends on which signal is going to be more important. If disturbances are going to be more important, then we're more likely to see aspen in the landscape. If the direct effects of climate are going to be more important, we're going to see less aspen. And this is going to be contingent on aspen's ability to survive and regenerate under future conditions. So if disturbances become more important in their effect, we're going to end up having more aspen in the landscape, which could translate to fewer fires, fewer outbreaks, fewer compounded disturbances, and less wind damage, all of which essentially amounts to a negative feedback, right, involving these same disturbances. If the effects of climate become and end up being more important, then we're likely to see less aspen in landscape, in which case maybe we'll see a conversion to return to conifers, but more likely a conversion to non-forest areas. Coming back to the topic of resilience and what all this means. First of all, identifying fundamental ecological change is only possible if we understand long-term variability. Otherwise, it's, I would argue, impossible. Second, I think we're seeing a shift in species composition following compounded disturbances. And this might be the embodiment of disturbance-mediated adaptation to climate change. So it is a shift in forest type, but depending on how we define our state, it remains as a forest. And this could result in negative feedbacks that may reduce fires as well as other disturbances. So keeping that in mind, I'd like to draw your attention in the time remaining to some of our work in European forests, very different ecosystems, but I think we'll see that some of the same themes are relevant there. And this is work in which Kathy was involved, and she mentioned she and I worked on this project when we were both on sabbatical in Switzerland last year. So these are a couple images of European forests, and we can see already that they're quite different than what we're used to seeing in the Rocky Mountains, right? These forests have been intensively managed for centuries, and they've been shaped by intensive land use, agricultural mainly, and other land use, for centuries to millennia. These are very densely settled ecosystems. As a result, natural dynamics have been fairly poorly understood. So when we think of and when we visit European forests, we typically see something that looks like this, like a nicely manicured landscape. But interestingly, mountain forest ecosystems are different in that they're in a relatively natural state compared to lowland forests, in part because they've been relatively inaccessible. So it's been more difficult, more expensive to get to them, to manage them, and so on and so forth. So these mountain forest ecosystems in Europe provide us with a unique opportunity to contextualize more recent environmental change in a longer term context, like we did in looking at quaking aspen. One of the things that's been happening in Europe over the past century and a half or so is that there's been an expansion of forest area, partly because agriculture is no longer as economically rewarding as it has been, and also partly as because of establishment of protected areas. And so in the upper figure, we see some repeat photographs, which you read from left to right, that show forest expansion. In this case, in mountainous areas. And in the lower figure, the gray bar graphs represent forest cover in the Alps in the early part of the 20th century versus forest cover in the Alps in the latter part of the 20th century. So again, the forest expansion across mountain forest ecosystems, and this is true across the continent as well. And along with that, we've seen an increase in forest disturbances, including bark beetle outbreaks, which are depicted in the figure on the left, and wind disturbances, which are depicted in the figure on the right. And this is happening across Europe. And this is partly as a result of the expansion of forest areas. Simply put, the more forests we have, the more forests will be disturbed. And there's also a climate signal here as well. Interestingly, as this has been happening in Europe, there's been a growing public interest in managing forests in more natural states. So living in the American West, we're used to ideas of wilderness. But in Europe, natural areas have been established for quite a long period of time, but ideas of wilderness are fairly new. And this is a screenshot from the website of the Bavaria Forest National Park. And the picture shows an outbreak, the effects of an outbreak of spruce beetle, Ips in this particular case. And there was a large windstorm in the national park, which was followed by this bark beetle outbreak. And the national park took the unprecedented step of doing nothing. And you can see their little motto, which isn't the best translation into English, but it's something like, let nature be nature, let nature be natural. And this was relatively unique because the long tradition in Europe has been to clean up disturbed areas, including national parks. But there's this change in perception, a change in human values. So natural disturbances and other processes are increasingly allowed to shape the structure and dynamics of some forests in Europe. But to say the least, the conversations are lively. So I don't know if any of you are following the nearly catastrophic debate on forest management in eastern Poland, where we have one of the largest old-growth forest reserves on the continent, and which is subject to logging right now because of the bark beetle outbreak. And this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So obviously, it's not a done deal yet. And as a result, it's important to contextualize recent disturbances. And so in order to do this, Kathy and I were involved in this special issue of Forest Ecology and Management, which just came out last month or something like that, which was a really neat project in which we brought together, and this special issue was organized by myself, Peter Bebby, who's in Switzerland, and Miro Svoboda, which is in the Czech Republic. And in this workshop, we came together from most European countries that have mountain forest ecosystems, from Scandinavia through the Alps into Italy and into the Balkan states. And we came together to look at and discuss how we can understand recent changes in a longer term context and what the management implications are of that understanding. And as an example, these are a couple of figures from one of the papers on which Momchil Panayotov was the lead. And this depicts disturbances in Bulgaria. And so we're in mainland Europe, right? We're in Bulgaria. And in some of the more remote valleys, we can find trees that established in the 1400s, which show evidence of wildfires, which are depicted by the vertical black marks on the right figure. And in other areas in the tree ring record, we see long-term evidence of wind disturbance. This is one example from Bulgaria. But actually, if we look at the continent as a whole, and if we look at disturbance regimes across European mountain forest ecosystems, we see the evidence of, and this figure is kind of an attempt at a synthesis. And this figure depicts the size of the circle is proportional to the size, maximum size of characteristic disturbances that we've seen over the past centuries. And the darker the shade, the more severe that those disturbances are. And we see across the continent evidence of relatively large, relatively severe disturbances, mostly by wind, bark beetles, in some places wildfires, and in some places avalanches. Interestingly, there's little or no trend in disturbance frequency or size where total forest cover hasn't changed. And this mainly refers to the Carpathian Mountains, until the more recent climate signal. One other aspect of these disturbances is that because in some places disturbances in Europe are not being cleaned up, sanitized, so to speak, we have an opportunity to look at the effects of leaving disturbances in the landscape versus post-disturbance logging. And this is work in Bavaria Forest National Park, and Simon Thorne was the lead author in this paper. Again, this is something that came out of the special issue. And what he found is probably not surprising to us from a North American perspective, but again, it informs the conversations in Europe, which has had a very different management history. Number one, post-disturbance logging often eliminates heterogeneity and the regeneration that is important for post-disturbance trajectories. Post-disturbance logging also takes away the advantage of bolstering biodiversity of actually most species in these particular landscapes. And it's also interesting to note that in places like Europe, old growth forests are relatively rare, relatively sparse, and restoration efforts which aim to create conditions that are emblematic of old growth forests frequently involve felling trees, creating dead standing snags, which are exactly the same things that the disturbances do, which we in Europe have typically been quick to get rid of. So if we're to contextualize recent trends in Europe, it is absolutely true. Disturbances have gotten larger, more frequent, and or more severe as a result of changes in forest cover and land use. That's absolutely true. But it's also true, and we can't dismiss the fact or the importance of the fact that all old forests show evidence of past disturbances. So fundamentally, this isn't something new. And I would argue that it's important for us, if we're going to say something is unprecedented, it's important for us to consider what about the phenomenon is unprecedented. Certainly not just the occurrence of these disturbances. And furthermore, this evidence exists despite centuries of intensive management to eliminate forest disturbances. Right? It just hasn't been successful even in such densely settled areas. So disturbances in and of themselves aren't threatening European forest ecosystems, as long as, of course, they're within a certain range of severities. So in an effort to tie all this together, these views of long-term dynamics in North America versus some of the things we're working on in Europe right now, and coming back to this concept of resilience. Again, I think one of the take-home messages, at least something that I'm happy to discuss, is that we have to carefully consider our definitions of states, because the way we define states is necessarily going to affect the way we define resilience, and it's going to affect whether or not we see ecological systems as changing or not. And again, coming back to this point, that the broader the range of conditions that we consider to be acceptable, normal, whichever term you want to use, the less likely we are to perceive a fundamental change, even a state change. And finally, it's really only possible for us to understand state changes if we understand long-term dynamics. I've talked about here perspectives of centuries. Earlier, Kathy and I were having a conversation about whether or not we should be looking at longer timescales. Even maybe that's relevant to this conversation as well. And so I think talking about long-term variability should be central to conversations of resilience and state changes. It's not that we should or could feasibly be managing force within ranges of variability. That's not the point. The point is that the past is an essential indicator to us of whether or not state changes are occurring or are not occurring. Another takeaway, I think, is that in some areas, containment of natural hazards is obviously going to take precedence, right? We have built homes and communities in fire-prone landscapes and in landscapes that are prone to other disturbances. And obviously, in those places, we need to prioritize mitigating the effects of natural disturbances. But disturbances also provide important ecosystem services, and they are compatible with multiple goals of forest use, even in fairly densely settled and developed regions, like Central Europe, for example, where we have national parks that are very severely disturbed and which use is still very much compatible with other uses which are important to society. Another point is that shifts in species composition following compounded disturbances, which are increasing under climate change, may represent disturbance-mediated adaptation to climate change. And I would argue that we should be watching those areas carefully to see how those areas play out. Especially since we might be seeing some negative feedbacks here involving disturbances. And finally, as we've seen in Europe, and I think we've finally realized in North America too, that disturbance isn't possible, nor is it necessarily desirable. Thank you for your kind attention. Yes, please.
You used the term ecosystem collapse at one point.
Yes.
Could you define both of those words in terms of what you meant in that respect? So that helps put things in a little bit different perspective.
Right. I'm not sure I can actually, but I invoke that term because I think it's a term that we're seeing in the literature to refer to state changes which are deemed to be unacceptable, right? And I think when we see the term ecosystem collapse in the literature, it usually involves topics of cascading effects, which have broad effects on a variety of taxa. But I think the term is not well defined, and I think it is a term that may not be helpful. And I think it's a term that I think we're living in a time period where ecosystems are changing very quickly, and I think it makes people nervous. It makes me nervous. It makes a lot of people nervous. And I think we may see some abrupt change, and we might assume an ecosystem has collapsed. But if we consider what that actually means, I think I can't think of a single scenario where an ecosystem doesn't continue. It may not continue in the way that it used to, but I think we have to allow some breadth for our consideration of what a state is.
It seems that there are so many components to an ecosystem.
Yes.
That to claim that it's collapsed gets wrapped up in the definition of in the components that comprise.
Absolutely agree with you. Absolutely agree with you. Yeah, and again, it's ecosystem collapse is not my term. It's one of the terms that shows up in the literature. Again, and I think it's a term that isn't well defined. And I think we should be looking carefully at these state changes. So if we have a conversion from coniferous forest to deciduous forest, right? Even in the Rocky Mountains, where we're not used to seeing that, most people would not call that an ecosystem collapse. We could even argue about whether or not that's a state change, right? What depends on what we mean by state. If we go from forest to non-forest, again, I think most of us would say that that's a state change, but is it an ecosystem collapse? I would say probably not. Yes.
Change is a change in the feedbacks, and so shift from aspen to conifer dominated is a change in sort of composition, but the feedback hasn't changed. They're still prone to fire that will push it back to aspen. And then sort of it continues. So the feedback is still there. So the shift in feedback is what moves the ball from one cup to the next. Is that how you're conceptualizing, I guess?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring that up because aspen are much less flammable than conifers, and they're less prone to wind disturbances and so on and so forth. And because of that, I'm not sure that if you have a conversion from conifers to aspen, you may have a delay in those types of disturbances. But if the aspen are then successionally replaced, which could play out over decades to centuries, then those same disturbances, those same processes that shape the ecosystem are still in play. But we would only be able to recognize that if we have a longer term view of ecosystems.
Right, but what if there was a compounded disturbance where there was no recruitment of trees?
Yes.
And so then you have a shrubland or a grassland that then is maintained by its own negative feedback, state maintaining, not that Chapin is not using negative feedbacks, he's using stabilizing feedbacks now. So they're stabilizing and amplifying feedback. So a stabilizing feedback which maintain a different dynamic, a different process is what you use. So I'm just wondering sort of, that's how I kind of think about the ball and cup and sort of trying to put it in the context of your research, but I'm just wondering what you think about it.
Yeah, I think the more important thing I see is that we be clear on what we mean by state changes.
Sure.
And I think the definition you put forth, to my way of thinking, is absolutely compelling. But I think one of the issues with our reliance on the term of resilience and ultimate stable state is that they're inconsistently defined. They're not well defined. And I think if we're consistent, we're better off than if they're vague. Yes.
So you mentioned that the aspens, there was a correlation with drought years, but you also mentioned that they didn't just die. You could see a sequence of not much growth and then death.
Yes.
And coupled with that, you had the disturbance climate and climate disturbance. So how long, my question is, how long, I guess, did that take for those trees to die? So I kind of thought it was prolonged drought, maybe that would be the killer of these things. But what if it's more of a disturbance climate, not necessarily climate disturbance, or what if it's more equal?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of climate or drought as a disturbance itself, and then maybe a windstorm or something. So how long did it take for those trees to die, and what if it's more equal instead of one or the other?
Yeah. Yeah, the clearest climate signals we saw, or rather I should say, the clearest correlations between reduced growth and mortality were somewhere between 3 and 10 years, depending on how you're looking at it. So it's something like that. And I think the important point there is that we're talking about a prolonged process. So if we're entering a period of prolonged drought, then we can anticipate at some point increased aspen mortality. The trade-offs between, or the contradictory effects between climate and disturbance, I think are interesting because we're seeing different effects. So if we think of drought as the direct effect of climate, and if we think of disturbances as the indirect effect of climate, what we're looking at is a scenario in which the indirect effects of climate change are favoring, in this case, aspen, but the direct effects of climate, meaning drought, are inhibiting aspen. And so there are multiple contradictory effects. And I think at this stage, it's difficult, or at least I'm not sure how we would figure it out, which one is going to be important in the long term. And it could be that it oscillates, could be both. I suspect there would be geographical components. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it varied across stands. Yeah, so there were, yeah, it's termed sudden aspen decline, and the acronym is SAD. So you can imagine, the newspaper articles, right? But if you visit those sites in the field, there are some sites in which there's actually, there is above, there's mortality of the canopy, but there's a lot of regeneration. But there are other sites where there's mortality of in the canopy and hardly any regeneration. And those are the sites that are, obviously, I don't know if the clone is dying or something. But what's interesting is that historical map I showed. There were a couple of those across Western Colorado with which we work. And there were some areas where our tree ring methods detected an age structure in aspen, which is consistent with post-fire establishment, meaning there's a pulse of establishment, which coincided with the fires of the late 19th century. But the historical map did not depict those areas as having burned. So initially, my thinking was, okay, so it's an old map, whatever, the guy was on horseback, he missed it. But then I started wondering, in the context of the sudden aspen decline, whether or not that time period, which was very warm and very dry, may have led to this type of sudden aspen decline in areas that did not burn, and then in some areas the aspens resprouted. So essentially you have a drought effect on age structure, which I don't think we're used to thinking about when we think about aspen clones. But the other interesting thing with the clones is that a lot of this I don't have the data quite ready yet, but a lot of the areas which are shifting from conifer to aspen dominance after the most recent fires are actually aspen seedlings that are establishing and growing, which, if you get into the aspen literature, you'll be told that that's impossible. But we're seeing it. Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think those little sprouts can persist for hundreds of years. And then conditions are right and they shoot up. Yeah, Kath.
One thing about the European forests is they're not natural in that they've already, some of them are planted forests. A lot of them are in areas that, had long ago been cleared of forest. There's key species missing. There's some overrepresented. So it's interesting, this idea that you're sort of restoring naturalness to a forest that's fundamentally missing a lot of species that were native to that place.
Yeah. 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 And
all you're doing is restoring some kind of natural structure, but you're missing fir in a spruce forest. You're missing, you have too much beech, and chestnut is closed forest. And anyway, I wondered what your thoughts were.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And if we're talking about European forests, I think we we have to consider different aspects of the forest, like you said. And I think if we move from a forest structure that's well manicured and kind of homogeneous to one that's more heterogeneous, I think we can argue that we're moving towards a more natural condition, even if the species aren't something that we would have expected a century ago. But then again, should we either desire or expect so-called native species, or should we be okay with changes in species composition, which may be better adapted to future climatic conditions? Right? In which case, we may not have a historical assemblage of species, but maybe some sort of dynamics which are closer to what we would consider natural. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think you're still missing a lot of key players. So now they plant Douglas fir when Willie Tinner would say they should be planting fir. Fir was there before, and so just restoring structure, but not biodiversity. The native biodiversity, I think, is. I'm not arguing whether it's good or bad, but it's not incomplete. It's incomplete. Thank you. So.
Yeah.
Did you look at all at in your look at surviving versus dying aspen? Did you look at all at differences in climate sensitivity between the two groups, or how tightly coupled the climate signal was with the growth signal?
Yeah, let me remember. We did. And I have to confess, I don't recall the details.
Didn't blow your mind, obviously.
I'm sorry?
It didn't blow your mind, whatever that.
Whatever it was. It may have blown Philip's mind. But I don't recall the answer to that question. But I do know that if we pulled the aspen that had died and the aspen that had not died, there was a really clear signal of both temperature and precipitation. But I have a vague recollection we did look at that, but I don't recall exactly how we did.
Great, thanks.